Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kalina Shukarova-Savovska, and I'm a Senior Financial Management Specialist at the WorldBank Center for Financial Reporting Reform here in Vienna, Austria. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this distance learning event, providing an update from the International Auditing and Assurance Standard Board, the International Ethics Standards Board, and IFAC Small and Medium Practices Committee. Joining here with me from Vienna is my colleague Piotr Pizziak and a familiar face from the Audit Training of Trainers program. This event is organized under the EU Reparis program and the Audit Training of Trainers activity of the Education and Capacity Development component. It is made possible by the generous financial support of the European Union. We would like to thank IFAC, its SMP Committee, the International Auditing and Assurance Standard Boards, and the International Ethics Standards Board for their significant support with this virtual learning event and the Audit Training of Trainers program. We have four distinguished speakers with us today. We have Megan Zietsman, who is the IAASB Deputy Chair. Megan has more than 26 years of experience as a practitioner and is a partner in Deloitte & Touche in USA. Megan is part of Deloitte's Technical Advisory Board and leads the firm's development and maintenance of audit policies and guidance. In addition to serving on the IAASB, Mrs. Zietsman leads a variety of activities relating to audit standard setting, including analyzing proposals from regulators and standard setters in the US and globally, drafting comment letters, and leading implementation activities. Megan will speak to us today about the work of the International Auditing and Assurance Standard Board over the past 12 months, highlighting the current and ongoing projects. Among others, Megan will speak about revisions of standards, observations of the joint group between the Education Standard Board, the Ethics Board, and the IAASB on the Professional Skepticism Group, launch of the project proposal on emergent forms of external reporting, and other projects. We will also have an opportunity to hear from Megan with the upcoming priorities of the International Auditing and Assurance Standard Board in the year ahead, as well as the planned next steps regarding their projects and consultations. Joining us is also Diane, Jules, a Deputy Director at the International Education Standard Board of Accountants. Prior to joining the Ethics Standards Board, Jules was a Senior Technical Manager at the International Auditing and Assurance Standard Board, and before that, an Assistant Chief Auditor at the US Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. Mrs. Jules also served as an assurance manager at Grant Thornton. Alongside will be Gary Hannaford, who will be delivering a joint presentation with Diane. Gary recently retired as a member of the International Ethics Standards Board for Accountants, where he was a member since January 2012. During his most recent engagement with the Ethics Board, Gary chaired the Safeguards Task Force, which resulted in a significantly enhanced conceptual framework for the code. Mr. Hannaford was formerly the Chief Executive Officer for the Chartered Professional Accountants of Manitoba and was also the chair of CPA Canada's Public Trust Committee. In December 2017, the Ethics Board completed its project to restructure its code for ethics for professional accountants, as well as its project to review the clarity, appropriateness, and effectiveness of the safeguards in the code. Diane and Gary will speak to us today about these changes and other completed projects that come into effect June 15, 2019. Participants will also be briefed on the Ethics Board forthcoming public consultation on its future strategy and work plan. Last but not least, we have with us Katharine Bagshaw, who is the Deputy Chair of the IFAC Small and Medium Practices Committee and also Chair of the IAASB Rapid Response Task Force. Katharine oversees the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales' work on international standards on auditing. She is also Secretary to its ISA implementation subgroup and its Public Company Accounting Oversight Board panel. Katharine is the author of numerous articles and publications on ISA. She is a chartered accountant with 25 years of experience specializing in UK and international auditing standards. Katharine will discuss some of the ongoing initiatives of the IFAC SMP Committee over the past year, including recently developed support tools, such as the publication on agreed-upon procedure engagements and the publication on creating value for SMEs through integrated thinking. Katharine will also update participants about the IFAC SMP Committee priority activities for the year ahead. Let me share a few words about the venues, the participants, and a few final technical notes before we launch the session. Participants are joining either via WebEx connections or through VCs from the following venues: Albania, Tirana, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Sarajevo, Kosovo, Pristina, Macedonia, Skopje, Montenegro, Podgorica, and Serbia, Belgrade. Participants from other regions are also joining via WebEx. In order to have a successful session, I would like to ask all sides to make sure that their microphones are turned off while not speaking. Participants joining via WebEx should make sure the mute button is on. In case a site is dropped during the session, please redial to join, if through WebEx connection, or seek IT support at your WorldBank venue for VC connections. Now, without further ado, let me hand over to Megan, who will give us an update from the IAASB. Megan, if you hear me, I'm passing over to you. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Kalina. I'm here, and good day to everybody. It's a privilege to be here with you today to talk a little bit about the activities of the IAASB. So, Kalina, thanks for driving my slides. Maybe we can just go to the first slide, which I think some of you may have seen before. We've used this slide for a little while. It's what we familiarly call the House of Audit, and it's really a graphical depiction of the key audit-related projects that we have on the go. So you can see that we have at the foundation of the house our work on quality control, our firm system of quality control, that's our work on ISQC1 and what will be a new ISQC2. So later on in the presentation I'll talk about those in a lot more detail. Building on top of that foundation, we have our work on professional skepticism, which we really see as foundational to all of our auditing standards. And what we're trying to do as we go about the work on the pillars, which we'll see are the discrete audit related projects, is to really look at ways that we can infuse a better appreciation of professional skepticism and really draft our standards in a way to really improve the ability of the auditor to exercise professional skepticism as they address the requirements of the standards. And then we have the pillars, as I mentioned. We have quality control at the engagement level, which is ISO 220. Then we have our foundational risk assessment standard, ISO 315, followed by the work on ISO 540, our accounting estimate standard, and then group audits, which really builds on top of ISO 220 and the other ISOs, but has the special considerations that are applicable in the audit of a group. And then we really have the roof, which is, I guess, kind of the objective or the overall goal here, which is to have standards that will support the performance of high quality audits, but also take account of the fact that the environment in which we operate, the environment in which the entities that we audit operate, are continually changing and kind of changing at an ever increasing pace. So we're dealing with advancements in technology, which are causing fundamental changes in the way that companies operate and that businesses work. also impacting the way in which auditors are doing audits and providing new opportunities to use sophisticated technology tools and other innovative solutions to really up the game. And then obviously in a world of ever-increasing complexity, where you have complexity in financial reporting frameworks, as well as in business models and the like, and then really just a continuing demand for the standards to continue to be fit for purpose. So, Kalina, maybe if we go to the next slide, and this one I'm not actually going to try to talk to in a lot of detail, but we thought we'd provide this to you, which is what we now call the House of Audit under Renovation, which is really a way to show how we are connecting the dots between a number of these very key projects. And really drilling down into the details and the interlinkages. So it's a graphical, again, depiction of the things that we're focused on and what I'll spend time talking about today. So a lot of the little pictures and things that you see on this slide we'll cover in the successive slides. So Kalina, with that, let's move then to the next slide, which is a sort of an overview of what we will be focused on this upcoming year. So we have a very heavy agenda for this year and a lot of things that we are targeting to bring to finalization or to exposure draft stage. So the most important project that is, or the one that's top of our list at the moment, is our finalization of ISO 540, which is our estimate standard. So this one we've been working on for a while, as I think you're probably all aware. And this was really driven in large part by the need to really look at the standard and its ability to deal with very complex estimates that have high degrees of estimation uncertainty, involve lots of subjectivity and judgment. So where I was talking a little bit about the focus of our activities for this upcoming year. So top of the list is the finalization of ISO 540. So this is we're in the final stages of making the changes to the standard based on our public comment period last year when we went out with an exposure draft, and I'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about what we're dealing with in terms of changes there. But we're targeting to try to get that out in June of 2018. So following shortly behind ISO 540 is an exposure draft of ISO 315, and we're targeting getting that out also in our June meeting. And when I talk in a few minutes, you'll see there's some interactions between these two, so it will actually be quite important to try to stage the timing of that finalization of the ED at the same time as the finalization of 540. Then in September, we'll be focused on getting the exposure draft out on ISQC1, which is the firm level quality control. And then in December, we'll pick up ISQC2 and ISO 220, which is engagement level quality control. We're still thinking, and we have to have some discussions with our board about the expected exposure periods for those exposure drafts. But we're thinking that ISQC1 in particular would have a longer exposure period because it's a longer standard. We understand that people will take some time to potentially have to translate it, but also just really think about it because it is going to be a fairly significant change to the current standard. And we also recognize the importance of having ISQC1 out at the same time as ISQC2 and ISO 220 so that respondents can see the kind of the package all together. So the other projects that we continue to progress will be ISO 600. So we'll be progressing that. We don't have a lot of time at the board level to be able to be talking about ISO 600 until we're finished with the rest of the projects on this list. But we're going to try to keep it moving along so that once we start to free up some time on our board agenda, that we'll be able to bring ISO 600 back to the board and then work towards trying to have an exposure draft of ISO 600 done towards the end of 2019. We continue to work on our agreed upon procedures project, and I'll talk about that also in a little bit more detail. And we'd be looking to have that be an exposure draft probably sometime in early 2019. We also have a project, the acronym there, EER, stands for Emerging Forms of External Reporting, which is a project that's looking at how we might develop guidance that would illustrate how to apply the international standards, and maybe in particular ISAE 3000, to engagements that involve providing assurance on different types of things other than just financial information. So that's an interesting project. It probably will result in some form of guidance, but it would be, probably something that would also still have a public comment period. So we're continuing to make progress on that in that regard. And data analytics and professional skepticism are also two ongoing projects. I already mentioned professional skepticism and how we're thinking about that in our ongoing projects. Data analytics is the same. I've got a slide later on that'll give you a little bit more detail. But what we're also trying to do is, as we work on the other standards, is to infuse content around data analytics. So, for example, as we look at ISO 315, we are going to be looking at including some application guidance about the different types of techniques and technologies that you might use to perform better risk assessment procedures. We also have a new project that we are hoping to commence sometime in 2018, again, really contingent on staff and board resource freeing up so that we can get focused on it. And this project would be picking up some of the threads of professional skepticism, data analytics, but also just be looking more fundamentally at ISO 500, and then also the implications potentially for our analytical procedures standard, ISO 520, audit sampling, ISO 530. And then throughout, we have an ongoing focus on the needs of smaller and medium-sized practitioners and audits of smaller and medium-sized entities. And I'm sure you will look forward to hearing from Katharine a little bit later on in this presentation. So, Kalina, with that, let's go on to just a little bit more detail about what we're up to on 540. So if you want to go to the next slide and then maybe right on to the next one. And this is just a picture of the responses that we had to the exposure draft on 540. You'll see we had a total of 69 letters spread across various different stakeholders and also from various different parts around the world. So it was a good response. Lots of people took a lot of time to write us very detailed and very thoughtful comment letters. So if we go to the next slide, you can see some of the responses already at a high level, what the responses were. So in general, we heard from respondents that they were supportive of our objectives in revising 540, which was essentially to strengthen it and make it more clear how to apply it to really an ever-evolving world of increased complexity in accounting estimates. However, even though we heard support, we also heard a lot of concerns about the complexity of the proposal and potentially the impracticality. So people struggle to really understand how the proposals would be applied in practice. We had tried to introduce a threshold in the standard, kind of a fork in the road, for when you might have a simple estimate where you had lower inherent risk, that you might have basically a more simple response, and which was an attempt to introduce some scalability. And then if you had something that was more than low, a much more robust set of requirements that dug into the various different factors, being estimation, uncertainty, judgment, and complexity. But I think there were a lot of questions. People didn't really understand how that would work, and also just struggled from the perspective of, when would you be at that low versus not low, and it just seemed to raise a lot of confusion and a lot of questions. So we did get support for the 3 risk factors that we built in, and these really were 3 risk factors that we saw as the drivers of inherent risk related to an estimate. But people thought that it would be better to incorporate these into the existing approaches to auditing an estimate, which we have in our extant standard, which would be looking at events after the balance sheet date, developing an independent estimate, or testing management's process. So it was never the intent to eliminate those approaches, but I think people saw the proposal as having that outcome. And then we also heard that there was a greater focus needed to look at the data assumptions and the methods and the auditing of each of those pieces. At the same time that we came out with our proposal, the PCAOB in the US came out with a proposal to overhaul their standard. And when people looked at that, it had some elements that seemed like they were more intuitive, but there was also a call for the IAASB to not create unnecessary difference with the PCAOB, because this is an area where then it would just cause problems for firms' methodologies and inconsistencies potentially in application. So definitely had a call to go and have a look at what they had proposed and see whether that would align or be responsive to a lot of the issues that people raised. So if we go to the next slide, we then have done a lot, the task force has done a lot of work in terms of taking on all of those comments and have done some substantial revisions of the standard. We had a good discussion with our board in September and December, and we are looking forward to having a discussion in a couple of weeks' time in March, where we will hopefully bed down at least the requirements and then continue to work on the application guidance. So just at a very high level, we've gone down the path of retaining a rigorous risk assessment requirement. We've taken away the threshold, and in lieu of that, we are looking at a better reinforcement of the ability to be scalable through words in the requirements and then through application guidance. We've got an increased focus on controls, making it very clear that it's important to understand the controls and then also recognize that in some cases it may be necessary to test the controls, including when substantive procedures alone might not be enough. Also got to focus on the importance of looking at contradictory evidence and not just focusing on evidence that might corroborate management assertions. And then we restructured the requirements to align more closely with those in the extant standard. So Kalina, maybe if you just go to the next slide, the next steps here are a first read of the full revised standard in March of 2018, some ongoing tweaks to the requirements, and then the task force has made some very substantial overhauls to the application guidance, including moving a lot of background information into appendices. So it will be interesting for the board to discuss that in March. There'll be ongoing outreach between now and June to try to reach out to different stakeholders to get their views and maybe explain to them a little bit more about what's been happening. And then we will have a plan for a final approval in June of 2018. So let's move now to ISO 315, which is the next big project that we're working on. As I mentioned, we're working towards an exposure draft in June on this one. And here I've got a series of flowcharts, which we'll probably just walk through relatively quickly, and I can try to explain to you the focus of this project. So this flowchart that you see is really I guess a graphical depiction of the different pieces of ISO 315. So we have a focus on understanding of the entity and the financial reporting framework. And just by reference, the paragraph references here are actually references to the December version of our draft. So if anyone wanted to, they can go to our website and pull that draft down, and you'll see the paragraph references. But we also obviously have an updated version that we will be discussing for our March meeting. The structure of the boxes, however, still hangs together with the revised version. So we look at understanding the entity and the financial reporting framework, and we're putting more focus on that financial reporting framework as really the driver for how we might think about risks of material misstatement. We've then got to focus on the understanding of the system of internal control, and then we show how that brick comes together and really forms the basis for being able to identify and assess the risks of material misstatement. So this is a standard where we've heard people say it's got lots of requirements and it's not really clear to see how the whole picture comes together. Some of the work that we're doing, it is an attempt to try to really make that more clear. So really kind of trying to clarify why we have a lot of these requirements. All right, so if we go on to the next slide, this is just drilling down a little bit into the understanding of the system of internal control. So we start broadly with the system. We then have requirements that focus on each of the components of the system of internal control and really trying to clarify what the auditor needs to do with respect to each of those pieces. And then we go down to identifying controls relevant to the audit, putting particular focus on general IT controls. And that's actually another thread through this project, is to really improve the focus on the IT aspects so that it's more clear what you need to do and the importance thereof. And then there is the similar requirement to what we have today to do to evaluate the design and determine the implementation of those controls that are considered relevant to the audit. Then we move to the next chart, and this is now really where we get into the nuts and bolts of identifying and assessing the risks of material misstatement. So all the information that we've gathered as part of understanding the entity and its environment, the financial reporting framework, and the system of internal control comes together to form the basis for thinking about where the risks of material misstatement might be and then assessing their significance. So it's this area where it's still a little bit of a work in progress, but what we have agreed with the board so far is that we will focus on a separate assessment of inherent risk and then control risk. And on the inherent risk side, we'll be bringing in consideration of qualitative inherent risk factors. So this is very aligned with the approach that we're taking in 540, where we're looking at those inherent risk factors and thinking about how they give rise to inherent risk. So without taking account of the effect of controls, but really thinking specifically about how the level of complexity, level of ambiguity, level of judgment, etc., drives the risk of material misstatement and its significance. What we're also going to draw out more clearly is that not all risks are the same, so that risks exist along a spectrum. So starting at the lowest and then going right up to the highest, which is where your significant risks would be, and then recognizing that when you get over to ISO 330, we already have the requirement there, which says that your responses need to be responsive to the reasons for your assessments of risk. So making sure that as you get higher in the spectrum, you need more evidence and you need to do more. And then we'll have a focus on the control risk piece of it, which is really going to be, again, drilled down from your understanding of the system of internal control, informed also by your conclusion as to whether or not you're going to have to go and test the controls. But we're also flagging, when you're thinking about that piece of it, making sure that you're thinking about whether you're actually in a situation where substantive procedures alone are not enough, so you're actually going to have to test those controls. Another significant change that we're making is we're actually introducing a definition of a significant account and relevant assertion. These are somewhat aligned with the same definitions that are used in the PCAOB standards and really are tied to whether or not there is a risk of material misstatement. So you would start with relevant assertion. If there's a risk of material misstatement at the relevant assertion level, then the applicable account would be considered a significant account. And then that's really the framework for the risks that you need to identify. So maybe if we go to the next slide, Kalina, this just gives you a little bit of an overview of some of the things that we continue to discuss, and we'll be having some discussion with the board in a couple of weeks when we meet. Making sure that we've nailed the work effort relating to controls. A little bit of focus on what we're calling the indirect controls, which are those that might be in the more entity level components, so your control environment, risk assessment, monitoring type controls. This is the direct controls, which are going to be maybe the more process level or transactional controls that specifically address risks that you might have identified. Some ongoing work on the work around inherent risk factors, particular focus on including susceptibility to bias and linkage to fraud risk in those, which obviously is important from the professional skepticism perspective, but also just making sure that we really are tailoring the risk assessments appropriately where we have higher degrees of inherent risk. I mentioned the interaction of the risks and significant accounts, and I talked about the significant risk. Material balances, we've also looked at the requirement that sits in ISO 330 paragraph 18, which is kind of a catch-all. It's kind of a requirement today that basically says, irrespective of your risk assessment, go do something on the big balances. But what we've discovered is that people don't really understand what that is, and maybe the procedures that people are doing to respond to that requirement might not necessarily be meaningful. So we're going to clarify that requirement really applies to those accounts where you haven't identified a risk of material misstatement, but which are nevertheless material, so big numbers. So once you've gone through that whole risk assessment process and you've come up with all your risks of material misstatement, you may still have account balances that are quantitatively large, for example, that this requirement would then cause you to do a procedure. And this is really kind of just a double check on the risk assessment process and in recognition that, nothing is perfect, and really just wanting to make sure that we don't leave anything that's big untouched and on the table. So on the next slide, there's ongoing coordination with the 540 task force, and this is in conjunction with really getting the wording aligned between the consideration of the inherent risk factors, the spectrum of risk, the controls relevant to the audit. It's a little bit tricky, because obviously we're going to finalize 540 before the 315 standard would be finalized. So it's possible that once we actually get done with 315, we'll have to go back and make some minor wording edits to 540, or at least that's the hope, that we can at least get the concepts all aligned so that at the end of the day we're just making tweaks to the words at the end when we need to. So a little bit of a sequencing challenge there, but we're working through that. I think I mentioned professional skepticism. We are ongoing focus with data analytics, looking at including guidance on how to use different techniques, focus on information technology, and then very importantly on this one, we're looking at scalability, how to introduce that through the requirements and the application guidance, and how to provide different examples, because we do recognize that the standard is a particularly challenging one to scale for audits of smaller and less complicated entities. So, Kalina, with that, let's move to ISQC1. And I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to tell you we have a lot of slides in this deck. And when we pulled the deck together, I thought it made sense to provide you with a lot of the detail so that you can use this really as a reference deck. But I'm not going to talk to every single slide in the deck. Otherwise, I'll carry on for much longer than my allotted time. So let me just overview briefly what we're doing for each of the quality control projects. And then at your leisure, you could look through some of the detailed slides, which will give you a little bit more background. So with maybe we can just go to the first slide, Kalina, which is our diagram. And that really is a graphical depiction of what we're trying to do with quality control. So we really are trying to modernize ISQC1 to make it more of a proactive standard, make it more capable of being scaled to firms of different sizes and firms that actually do different types of engagements, keeping it principles-based, but also retaining the robustness of the existing standard. So this is an attempt to really try to pull together all the pieces of the current standard, which arguably are somewhat disconnected in today's environment. And again, we recognize that this is a standard that people struggle with in terms of how to scale it and how to implement it in a reasonable way for smaller entities. So the actual model that we're going down is an 8-component model, which really would make up the whole system of quality management. So the components are similar to those that you would see in COSO and those that we've just gone over in the ISO 315 revisions, but not quite the same, because obviously they're tailored for a firm system of quality control. So you'll see in the middle we have the kind of the elements of, or the aspects of the really the core of the quality control process, being the governance, the leadership, the information and communication, the focus on relevant ethical requirements, acceptance and continuance, the resources, which is not just the human resources, but also the intellectual as well as the technological resources that a firm might need to put in place, but also the financial resources to support the system and the engagements that are performed pursuant to the firm's system of quality control. And then requirements around engagement performance and really supporting, and that's where we have a strong link, obviously, to ISO 220, which is quality control at the engagement level, a recognition that the firm might set policies and procedures that are then implemented at the engagement level. Around that, you then have the quality management process, which is the process of going through for each of these components, setting out the quality objectives, identifying the risks, and then having responses that are designed and implemented. In that piece, there are going to be some what we're calling prescribed objectives and risks, which pick up on the existing requirements. But then the expectation would be that a firm would tailor those and expand upon them based on their circumstances. So a very large, complicated firm may have to build that out quite significantly. A much smaller firm likely not. And then around the big blue ring around the side is or on the outside is the monitoring and remediation process, which really picks up the importance of monitoring the whole system and then really doing an investigation into the findings, picking up all the concepts of root cause analysis, and then the evaluation of deficiencies, and then really supported by an annual stand back that the firm leadership would do to really conclude whether or not the system really is providing the reasonable assurance that quality can be achieved. So that's in a nutshell. So I think what we'll do now is maybe just skip over the detailed slides. So Kalina, if you can just skip past to the slide on ISQC2. Let me talk briefly about the proposed ISQC2. So what we are going to do with ISQC2 is that it's going to be a separate standard that will deal with engagement quality control reviews. So the decision to separate this out into a separate standard was made so that we could give appropriate focus to the engagement quality control review process and really look at strengthening those requirements and retain the right balance between ISQC1 and ISQC2, and also recognizing that engagement quality control reviews are obviously not required in all circumstances and are just one response that a firm might implement to monitor or manage against a quality risk. So maybe if we just go to the next slide, there's a quick picture there of what we're trying to address with ISQC2. We're going to focus on the scope of the engagements, so it will still be required for listed entities, but we'll put in some focus here on the importance of the firm looking at whether there should be other engagements that should be subject to the EQC review. We'll focus on the eligibility of those individuals who would be appointed to be EQC reviewers, focus on the importance of appointing the right people, and then focusing on what the review really needs to entail. So, and some clarification on timing and strengthening maybe the nature and extent, and also a focus on the documentation. This is also an area where we have a joint working group with the ethics board, and the issue that working group is looking at is the objectivity of the EQC reviewer, and really exploring the question of should there be a cooling off period for someone who's been an engagement partner before such time as they can be the EQC reviewer. So we're looking into that issue and determining how best to deal with it in the respective standards. Okay, so let's have just a few words now on ISO 220, which is the engagement level quality control. So maybe, Kalina, we can just go to the next slide. And this slide shows really the interactions between firm level quality control and engagement level quality control. So firm level is the process that I've just gone through and described. And then what this diagram acknowledges is that some of what the firm might design is actually intended to be implemented at the engagement level. So you see the loop coming from the firm level down into the engagement level. And then you have the responsibilities of the engagement partner to understand what the firm expects to be done at the engagement level and obviously execute against that. But then also think about the nature and circumstances of the specific engagement and what needs to be done in order to achieve quality at the engagement level. So, that might be, for example, bringing additional expert resources to the table. It might be using a particular software tool that's available. It might be increasing the nature, timing, and extent of direction and supervision, etc. So really that the engagement partner is the one who's responsible for designing that whole plan for managing and achieving the quality at the engagement level. And then it also recognizes that there's a feedback loop that as the engagement partner executes at the engagement level, they have a responsibility to feed back to the firm level information that might be relevant to the firm's system of quality management. So the two systems really intertwine. So the next slide is just a little picture of the leadership responsibilities of the engagement partner. So really emphasizes, and this is what we are focused on in ISO 220, is the importance of leadership responsibility, the importance of the engagement partner being responsible for the achievement of quality at that engagement level, recognizing, however, that different tasks and things might be assigned to other members of the engagement team in order to help the partner discharge that responsibility. So we'll be looking at expanding the requirements around direction, supervision, and review, putting a focus on the fact that the partner is responsible for having the right amount of involvement throughout the engagement in order to be able to discharge that responsibility. And we're thinking about incorporating a standback at the end of the engagement. So before the report is dated or signed, that the partner takes a step back and says, yep, I really was, I was involved enough, I'm feeling feeling confident I have the basis in order to be able to take responsibility overall for this engagement. So then there are a few more slides which I won't go through in detail, that give you a little bit more detail about the granular things that we're trying to deal with in ISO 220. So maybe, Kalina, if we can just move over to group audits. Let me just say a few words on ISO 600. I think I mentioned earlier in the introductory remarks that we're continuing to try to progress group audits. We are liaising with the other task forces, so 220, the Quality Control Task Forces, and ISO 315, to really make sure that group audit implications are being thought about. We have a lot of information from our ITC that we did a couple of years ago that teed up all the group audits issues and the potential things that we could do. So continue to focus on how we pull all of those together. We did issue a project update back in October of 2017, which really just gave some information to stakeholders about the status of this project, because we do recognize that this is one that's high on the list of focus for regulators and others, and important that we that we don't lose sight of it. But also because of its interconnectivity with ISO 220 and ISO 315, it's important that we sequence the projects correctly. So professional skepticism, I did mention that briefly, and that's, Kalina, if we can go on to the next, and then one more slide. We've had a joint professional skepticism working group, so this is actually, I won't say it's an experiment, but it's probably the first time, at least to my knowledge, that we've put together a joint working group of the Audit and Assurance Standards Board, the Ethics Board, as well as the Education Board, to really dig into this topic of professional skepticism, because we recognize that, there really isn't one single answer to the challenges around being able to improve the exercise and application of professional skepticism by professional accountants and practitioners. So we've done a lot of outreach, we've had a lot of discussions. We issued a little paper back in August of 2017, which really was a brief synopsis of our findings. We know that on the IAASB side, the answer here is not just littering the word professional skepticism all over our standards, but more thinking about how we draft requirements that are going to encourage a more challenging mindset of the auditor. So we continue to the subgroup of the professional skepticism working group that's focused on the IAASB matters continues to work with our other task forces, and then they continue also to work as a joint working group as we think more broadly about the topic. So I know I'm nearly out of time, so let me just quickly go over a couple of other projects and initiatives. Data analytics, I think I've mentioned that we're continuing to infuse that into the current projects that we have. We did do an outreach on this in early 2017, got a lot of responses, a lot of support for continuing to focus on this area, but also a caution that, careful how you go forward, that this is not just about, again, a quick change to the standards, but rather a more thoughtful process of thinking about how they need to be modernized and updated, but also recognizing that this is an area where I think a lot of experimentation is being done in practice as people are trying to figure out how to use some of these new tools, and then really think about what the challenges are that arise relative to the application of the current standards. But I think we have heard really broadly from many of our stakeholders that the standards today are not completely broken, so this is not like a quick fix needed, but obviously a need for them to be over a longer period of time overhauled and modernized for the ability to use these new techniques. So next slide, agreed upon procedures. Just a quick update there. I mentioned we have the project going on and that we're targeting an ED probably early in 2019. We had our project proposal approved in September. The bullets, and I won't read them all just in the interest of time, that we're looking at in revising ISRS 4400, and this is one of our standards that's still in old non-clarity format, so we'll be clarifying it, but also focusing in particular on the role of professional judgment, looking at the independence of the professional accountant, so another area where we will be coordinating with the ethics board, and then a couple of other issues that are more discrete. We will be having a discussion with our board in a couple of weeks on some of those issues. The next slide, I mentioned our project on emerging forms of external reporting. Again, we had a discussion paper here. There is information on the IAASB's website about this and some of the feedback. Again, strong support for the IAASB to continue to focus on this area. Not really support for another big standard setting project. So the standards, again, are not seen necessarily as a barrier here. But what I think people see as a challenge is how to apply those standards to different subject matters. And then maybe the next slide, just to remind everybody about our tools and guidance that we have on auditor reporting. On the slide are just a list of all the different resources that the IAASB has. We continue to focus on questions related to the implementation of the auditor reporting standards, and we will be planning a post-implementation review, which should probably commence later this year or in early 2019, which essentially will give 2 full years of implementation before such time as we actually dig into the post-implementation. But on this one, we're very encouraged at the feedback that we're hearing, and we're seeing a lot of reports and surveys and things coming out of different markets around the world. I understand the ACCA is about to come out in the next couple of weeks with a global survey that they've done, which will focus on a lot on trends in emerging markets as well as the more established markets, and really trying to give a good picture of what's happening with respect to auditor reporting and the various views of the different stakeholders. So that will be interesting to look at. And then just moving on to the last, I think probably the last slide I'll speak to, which is just a little overview of some of the other things that we have on, as if all of that was not enough. We still have a few other things that we are focusing on. So we're about to start, or we actually have already commenced, thinking about our strategy for 2020 to 2023. So the current strategy we have takes us through the end of 2019. So in order to have the new strategy in place by the beginning of 2020, we need to start now, because we need to go through a survey process and then a public consultation on the document, which will take place next year. So we're trying to think about this very broadly and think about really what is the role of the IAASB in the future, and how we might think about things differently, and really just trying to take into account a lot of the trends that we're seeing around technology, around increasing complexity, and then really just looking at that whole overriding desire to remain relevant and responsive to what our stakeholders are looking for. So I think that's going to be a very interesting process. I mentioned a couple of places where we have some coordination with the International Ethics Board, and we're obviously going to focus on that in an even bigger way. And really looking for ways in which we really should coordinate very closely. One of the things that we're looking at on the IAASB side right now is the impact of the newly restructured IESBA code, and thinking about the implications for our standards. I mean, in some cases, it's just updating references, but there's probably a few other places where we're going to have to make a little bit more of a substantive change to make sure that the standards remain in sync. I mentioned the Audit Evidence Project, which we are hoping to commence later this year, early into the following year. And then the last thing that I should just reinforce is the focus of that we have on audits of SMEs and the needs of smaller and medium-sized practitioners. So again, I know you'll hear from Katharine a little later on in this webcast, but at the IAASB level, this remains a very key focus. We held a roundtable early in 2017 in Paris, which is really a working conference attended by people from all over the world with an interest and a focus on the needs of smaller and medium-sized practitioners. We spent a day basically thinking about ISAs and another day on other services. A lot of interest, a lot of issues on the table, and a lot of support for the IAASB to continue to focus on this and really explore and push the boundaries of what can be done. So the IAASB has continued to do that. We'll actually have an executive board session discussion in March 2018 where we will explore some ideas. But it is possible that we will have a public consultation on this topic at some point in 2018, where we'll be able to get public views from our respondents. And then at some point, there probably also will be a repeat of the Paris Roundtable, maybe once that consultation has taken place, so that we can really take this a step forward. So the next slide, which I won't talk about, is actually just got a little bit of a brief summary of what we talked about with respect to the Paris conference when we debriefed it in March of 2017. So Kalina, with that, I think I'm going to wrap up, and I think it's time to pass over to the next speaker, but I'll look forward to people's questions at the end of the webcast. Thank you.
Megan, thank you very much for this very detailed presentation. Let me just re-emphasize that the slides will be made available on our web page following this event. We have already distributed the slides to the participants who registered. However, whoever didn't receive them yet can find them following this event on our web page. Megan, before I pass over to Diane and to Gary, there has been a request for a clarification. So if possible, I would like to ask Mr. Segundo Sanchez to ask this clarification, which is related to some of the slides in your presentation. So Mr. Segundo, if you hear me, please go ahead and ask for the clarification. Thank you.
Yeah, regarding the previous presentation about the material misstatement on how to assess. So my question about that is, can you elaborate on that, Ms. Megan? What are your bases, and so that we don't have some redundancy of idea in going through on our next audit procedures, if ever?
Okay. Sorry, I'm not sure if I really understand the question, but I think it's relating to ISO 315 and the requirements around identifying and assessing risks of material misstatement.
Yeah, that's it. Can you elaborate on that, on what are your bases? Because you have mentioned that substantive procedures alone are not enough on your, on the conclusion part.
That's right. So I think what we're trying to focus on there is the fact that when you identify and assess your risks of material misstatement, you think about inherent risk, which is the inherent susceptibility to misstatement. So not thinking about controls, but just thinking inherently how things like complexity, ambiguity, drive to the likelihood that you could have a misstatement in the particular account and that it could be material. And then separately, you would think about control risk, which would be the thinking about the effectiveness of the entity's controls in addressing that risk. And then once you've thought about that, that then provides you the basis for deciding how you are going to design your further audit procedures, which are your substantive procedures and your tests of controls, to address that risk. And then the focus on the substantive procedures alone are not enough is it's basically the reminder that would say, in some cases, given the nature of the account, the processing, etc., it may be that you cannot actually effectively address that risk without also testing the controls. So, for example, in a highly automated environment where there isn't a paper trail, where it would be just about impossible to try to audit that completely substantively. We're reminding people that, which is a requirement in the current standards, but we're just reminding people to really focus on that as you think about your further audit procedures.
So do we have any addendum or some criteria to be added aside from the substantive procedures like that? Like maybe analytical something?
Well, I mean, I think we still have the requirements in ISO 330, which would be the different types of substantive procedures that you would be able to do, which would include analytical procedures, but could also be tested detail, could actually be something that's sort of a new innovative technology tool as well that you would do, and then you would couple that up with the need to look at the controls. But you could also have a situation where you're doing a substantive procedure and the information that you're using, you need to get comfortable with that information, and you may have to test the controls over how that information was produced. So that might be another place where you need to factor in the controls. So I hope that answers the question. I'm not sure, maybe I didn't quite understand it.
Thank you, Ms. Megan.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Megan. Thank you for the presentation. We will have an opportunity to ask further questions to the participants in the questions and answer session that will follow the presentations of all speakers. Let me now pass over to Diane and Gary, who will provide an update on the Ethics Board.
So if you could turn to the next slide, Kalina. It gives a bit of an overview of what we intend to talk about during our presentation today. The timing of this presentation probably couldn't be much better because the Ethics Board had a fairly significant milestone meeting in December, at which time it approved a restructured code, as well as as part of that approval of the restructured code, it included approval of the Safeguards project and the changes to the code pertaining to Safeguards project, plus a number of other things, professional skepticism and professional judgment, and a small scale application that we did, as well as the applicability of the code to professional accountants in public practice as it pertains to information for professional accountants in business. As part of the restructured project itself, in addition to looking at those individual projects that were approved at the December board meeting, it also needed to restructure those parts of the code pertaining to previous projects that were approved by the board pertaining to matters such as no-CLAR, lung association, and some previous changes that had been made to professional accountants in business portion of the code. So we had to rewrite those in a way that were consistent with the way the code had been restructured. And the restructuring of the code now has been completed, but all of these projects were approved by the board at its meeting in December. They are going to the PIOB at its meeting next month to receive approval for following appropriate due process, and then we'll deal as part of our presentation today with the effective date of the changes. But I think it's important to understand that this is a really key time for the board and for the code itself because it's been totally restructured. So we will be looking at the changes at a very high level as to how the code has been restructured, dealing with the projects of the Restructure Task Force and the Safeguards Task Force, skepticism, applicability at the effective date. And then we'll also talk to you a little bit about some of the current projects that we have in play, as well as a little bit on the future strategy and work plan. We are a little bit further along than the IAASB in looking at our future strategy and work plan, in that we went to a survey this past year and are now in the process of finalizing a consultation paper, which will be put out for public consultation during 2018. If we could go to the next slide, please. One of the things that's important for the board is that there be a code that countries around the world wish to adopt. There are some 175 member bodies in IFAC and representing 135 countries, and there is a requirement to have standards in place that are no less stringent than the ethics code. Our hope would be that there would be adoption of the ethics code itself, and the code itself is used as a basis for national ethics requirements or converged in some 120 countries. And that's data that was available as of 2014. And we're aware of the fact that some additional countries have been adopting the code more recently than that. It's been translated into 36 plus languages, including the major UN languages. Next slide, please. You can see here that of the G20 countries, 12 of them have either adopted the code or based their code on the ethics code. And there are another 4 that have converged or on the path with the ethics code, and India itself is committed to it. I can speak specifically to the situation in Canada in that they are now have a rules-based code, but are looking more to move to a principles-based code that is much more closely aligned with the ethics code itself. There's convergence at the moment, but with the restructured code, there's a clear path moving towards adoption of the international code, and we're hoping that that will be taking place in other countries as well. If we could turn now to the next slide, please. Focusing more specifically on what we have done with changing the code. It was similar to the Clarity project that the IAASB put in place a few years ago, in that we wanted to have a much more clear code that would make it easier for member bodies to understand and for professional accountants to understand, so that they would be able to adopt it. And there had been some concerns raised that the code as it was written was too complex, wasn't user-friendly, didn't clarify what the requirements were versus the guidance material that was included in the code. So it was important that we try to strengthen the code by making it much clearer. And some of the things that we were hoping to do, and we believe that we haven't done as a result of restructuring the code, is we've really strengthened the overarching requirements that all professional accountants need to comply with the fundamental principles. And for those who are in the audit world, they need to be independent. We have enhanced and made much more prominent the conceptual framework. In earlier iterations of what we were looking at in the restructured code, in fact, we had gone so far as to make a reference on the top of every page of the code back to the conceptual framework. Felt that that really was a bit of overkill, but there is now clear cross-referencing back to the conceptual framework throughout many places in the code where it's believed to be appropriate. We believe that the new structure is now using much clearer language, which makes it much easier for members, professional accountants, to be able to use it. We clearly distinguish between the requirements versus the application material. The requirements are written in paragraphs that have an R in front of them, and the application materials then follow the requirements, so that it's much more obvious to the to professional accountants when they are using the restructured code. They'll know what a requirement is and what the application materials are pertaining to those requirements. We've also made it much clearer as to which requirements in the code pertain to public interest entities versus those which are non-PI, related to non-PIs. We've also tried to make it much clearer who is responsible for independence within the firms and network firms, and that's been made clear in various sections of the code as well. And the concept of independence is much more prominent in that it's now included specifically in the title of the code, and there's also reference made to it in the conceptual framework to indicate that the conceptual framework, while it applies to all professional accountants, makes it clear that many of the items, such as dealing with threats to independence, are the same threats that are used for threats to compliance with the conceptual framework. We can move on to the next slide, Kalina. This will give you a sense as to how the restructured code's architecture now looks. In the extant code, we had included in the first part standards pertaining to all professional accountants, and the second part of the code then pertaining to professional accountants in public practice. That was part B of the code. Part B of the code pertained to professional accountants in business. We felt, and included in the part B part that dealt with professional accountants in public practice, we had included in that area the international standards for independence. Felt it was important to restructure the way the architecture was for the code, and now have made it part 1 pertains to all professional accountants, as this is the foundation for the entire code. Part 2 will deals now with professional accountants in business. And if you're a professional accountant in business, you then may not need to look at Part 3 or parts 4A and 4B because they deal with professional accountants in public practice and with the independent standards, which also is for professional accountants in public practice. So we've restructured the architecture of the code in a way that is much more intuitive, and we've actually separated the independent standards from the professional accountants in public practice and made it a separate part all by itself, dealing with independence for audits and reviews in Part 4A, and that's sections 400 to 899. And then Part 4B deals with independence for assurance engagements other than audit and review engagements, which are sections 900 to 899. The glossary that's included at the back of the code pertains to all professional accountants and all matters that are included within the code itself. We could turn to the next slide, please, Kalina. The fundamental principles have not changed as to what we've included in the code. Basically, the fundamental principles are the foundation of our code, and what we are looking for is in applying the code is that a professional accountant needs to comply with the fundamental principles, and those are the four in the blue that are outside of the conceptual framework. So that's professional competence and due care, integrity, objectivity, confidentiality, and professional behavior. The way the code has now been restructured, we have separate subsections for each of those fundamental principles, explaining what is meant by each of the fundamental principles and how they would apply it to all professional accountants in applying the conceptual framework. Independence also relates to the conceptual framework. So essentially, when thinking about the conceptual framework, all professional accountants need to comply with the fundamental principles. They need to comply with the independent standards if they are indeed performing audits or other assurance engagements, and they need to apply the conceptual framework in doing all of that. So there's a requirement to comply with each of those matters, and that's been made much clearer now in the conceptual framework portion of the code. We could turn to the next slide, please. So the real strong basis for the conceptual framework is the basis that it's really not possible to include a complete list of all of the facts and circumstances that might trigger ethics issues. And while we may be able to identify many of them and address them in the code, it's not possible to address all such matters. If we were to do it on that basis, it would be a much more rules-based code. We believe that the ethics code needs to be a principles-based code. So we have put in place a conceptual framework. And the conceptual framework is one that started at the root that needed to be looked at first as we were engaging in the Safeguards project, which we began in January of 2015. And that project was to provide clarify the appropriateness and effectiveness of the use of safeguards in the code. And before we could look specifically at safeguards, we needed to look at the conceptual framework and how the conceptual framework was established. And we believe that we have enhanced that conceptual framework. The conceptual framework essentially begins with looking at whether or not there are threats to compliance with the fundamental principles or threats to compliance with the independent standards. And in doing so, the professional accountant needs to identify threats, evaluate those threats, and where the threats are not considered to be an acceptable level, the professional accountant needs to address those threats. And that takes place in every single situation of all professional accountants in what they're doing. And in doing so, they need to consider the overarching requirements to exercise their professional judgment, to remain alert for new information that may come along that might change the facts and circumstances that caused the threat in the first place. And then they also need to use the reasonable and informed third-party test in considering whether or not threats are at an acceptable level. If we could turn to the next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned, the basis for the conceptual framework is to identify, evaluate, and address threats. The categories of threats that were included in the extant code were these 5: self-interest, self-review, advocacy, familiarity, and intimidation threat. The task force itself and the board considered whether or not there should be additional threats that should be added, or if any of these needed to be changed. And there are some local codes that may have 1 or 2 additional threats included in them, so we had to consider them as part of our work. However, in looking at them, we came to the conclusion that there was no need to change the categories of threats that were included in the extant code. And there are definitions of these threats included within the code, and we have not changed them from the extant code. If we could turn to the next slide, please. As part of the work of the Safeguards Task Force, we felt that there were a number of terms that were used in the conceptual framework that either needed to be clarified, revised, or in fact, in some situations, we even needed to describe or define the term in the first place. I mentioned earlier that one of the overarching requirements is to use the reasonable and informed third-party test. And we have revised the terms that we've used in the reasonable and informed third-party test in a way that makes it very clear as to what is intended by what is a reasonable and informed third party. And this is a consideration that needs to be made by the professional accountant when considering threats about whether the same conclusions would be reached by another party. However, it's important to be sure that when you're thinking about what that other third party would think, that you don't need to be a professional accountant if you're that other third party. The consideration is made from the perspective of the reasonable informed third party, who needs to consider all of the facts and circumstances that the accountant would know or could be reasonably expected to know in coming to the conclusions. And as I mentioned earlier, the reasonable informed third party does not need to be an accountant, but needs to have enough knowledge to really understand and evaluate the appropriateness of the accountant's conclusions. So while it doesn't need to be a professional accountant, they need to have enough business acumen to really understand, based on what the professional accountant has done, as to whether or not they've come to the appropriate conclusion. We could turn to the next slide, please, Kalina. Another thing that we did was we looked at the description of safeguards, because one of the reasons why the Safeguards project was initiated was there was a concern raised by a number of stakeholders, particularly in the regulatory community, that what firms were doing, or what professional accountants were doing, was whenever they had identified a threat, they just took a look at that threat and said, well, all I need to do now is apply safeguards. And if I can apply a safeguard, excuse me, if I can apply a safeguard, then I've been able to deal with that threat. And that almost promotes a mentality of a tick the box approach to things. And we wanted to be sure that professional accountants were thinking about safeguards in a different way, because safeguards really do need to be effective in order to help the professional accountant in addressing the threats. So we revised the description of safeguards to say that only things that could be included as safeguards are those actions which are taken by the professional accountant, either individually or in combination with other actions, that effectively reduce the threat to compliance with fundamental principles or with independence when it's appropriate to an acceptable level. Now, there were a number of policies and procedures that were in place in the extant code that a firm might put into place, that the entity itself that's being audited might have in place, or even that the profession might have put in place, that were formally characterized as safeguards. But since these are not actions that are taken by the professional accountant to effectively reduce the threats, they're no longer categorized as safeguards themselves, but they can have an impact, first of all, on identifying whether or not there is a threat. And secondly, it helps to determine whether or not the threats might be considered to be at an acceptable level. So take, for example, a firm might have in place requirements to take a number of continuing education courses. That in itself is not something that is taken by the professional accountant to actually address the threat that's in place, but it may be a policy that's put in place by the firm. And if those policies are in fact being adopted, they can help reduce the threat to various of the fundamental principles or to independence, but they're not specifically something that are considered to be safeguards. So they are factors that still need to be considered, but not necessarily considered to be a safeguard. And that's a very important change that has been made, something that a number of SMPs were concerned with because they felt that we were taking away their ability to apply safeguards by changing our description of what is included to be a safeguard. In no way were we intending to take away actions that would be appropriate in determining whether or not the threat was at an acceptable level. We just wanted them to be considered in a slightly different basis. We could turn to the next slide, please. A couple other terms that first of all, what is considered to be an acceptable level, because I had said earlier that essentially what the professional accountant is trying to do is reduce the threat of non-compliance with the fundamental principle to an acceptable level. So what is really considered to be an acceptable level? And we have revised that term because it was written in a negative way in the past, and we thought it would be much better if we said this thing in a more positive way. So an acceptable level is a level at which the professional accountant, using a reasonable and informed third-party test, would likely conclude the professional accountant complies with the fundamental principles or with the standards for independence. The next term, appropriate reviewer, is one that is used particularly when applying safeguards when the professional accountant is performing non-assurance services as well as the audit, and when is it acceptable to be able to provide the non-assurance service. And one of the actions that can be applied as a safeguard is to have a professional with the necessary knowledge, skills, and experience and authority to review in an objective manner the relevant work performed by the service provided. We have adopted this term appropriate reviewer because we didn't want to say that it had to be somebody within the firm who is doing that review, who is objective, or whether or not the firm needed to look for an outside reviewer to be able to do this. So we've indicated in our description of the term appropriate reviewer the fact that they need to determine who the appropriate person should be. It might be a professional accountant, but the person needs to have the necessary knowledge, skills, experience, and authority to review. And I emphasize the words in an objective manner, the relevant work performed or the service provided. We could turn to the next slide, please, Lena. Again, I mentioned earlier that one of the things that's really critical in understanding the conceptual framework is the need to identify and evaluate threats. And in doing so, the professional accountant needs to consider what the facts and circumstances are in a particular situation, because every situation is different and professional judgment needs to be applied in determining whether or not there are threats to the fundamental principles or threats to independence. So you need to understand the professional activities, the interest, and the relationships that are taking place based on the particular facts and circumstances at the time. I mentioned the conditions, policies, and procedures in an earlier slide. This is used to determine, first of all, whether or not threats are in fact in place, and they can also be a relevant factor in determining whether or not the threat is at an acceptable level. Whenever a threat is not at an acceptable level, the professional accountants are required to address them, and that's made very, very clear in the enhanced conceptual framework. If we could turn to the next slide, please. So, addressing threats. we've identified the threat, we've evaluated the threat and determined that the threat is not at an acceptable level. What does the professional accountant do? Again, the concern that was raised in the past is it was always believed that you simply just needed to apply a safeguard and you're okay. Well, we've recognized the fact that that isn't a proper response to the fact that you have a threat to the fundamental principles or to independence. So there are three types of actions that could be taken. First of all, the professional accountant can eliminate the circumstances, including the interest or relationships with the client that's causing the threat to independence. They can apply safeguards where available and capable of being applied, but again, remember that the revised description, these safeguards need to be effective in reducing the threat to an acceptable level. Or the third possibility is declining or discontinuing the specific professional activity or service. So there are three possible ways of addressing any threats, and applying safeguards is not the only answer to that. And it's very important to understand that if you have not eliminated the circumstances and if applying safeguards is not effective, the third is a conclusion that one needs to be able to reach as a professional accountant. You need to decline the activity or discontinue the activity that you're taking. We can move to the next slide, please. So in our safeguards project, what we've resulted in is we've enhanced the conceptual framework. We've made it quite clear that there's a requirement to comply with the conceptual framework, to comply with the fundamental principles, or to comply with the independent standards. We've made it clear that in doing so, one needs to identify, evaluate, and address threats. And in doing so, you take into account the reasonable and informed third-party test, you take into account professional judgment, and you always need to be aware of facts and changes in the facts and circumstances. We have revised or clarified some of the descriptions of some key concepts, such as what is a safeguard and the reasonable and informed third party. We have specifically gone through the entire code to try to be sure that we have better correlated the threats that have been identified with possible actions that could be taken to be effective safeguards. We've also included in the revised conceptual framework a new step back requirement. And this is one that needs to be done in addressing threats. The addressing threat stage of the conceptual framework is a step back to be satisfied that the overall conclusion that has been reached, that the threats are now at an acceptable level, is appropriate. And the step back requirement is something that was new and has been well accepted by the respondents of our stakeholders. There is also a new emphasis included specifically in the code that if the threats cannot be addressed by either changing the relationship or by applying safeguards, the professional accountant must decline or end the engagement. And there are new and enhanced general provisions put in place for non-assurance services. We have in the extant code about 10 specific types of non-assurance services. And in the extant code, we indicated what actions could be taken to be able to address those. It's clear that we can't deal with all situations, all possible non-assurance services that the professional accountant might provide. So we needed to put in place some general provisions that allowed us to identify what processes the professional accountant needed to follow whenever a new type of non-assurance services might be identified. And clearly, as we're dealing with changes in the business environment these days and the use of technologies and all that, there are going to be additional non-assurance services that professional accountants will be putting in place. So we wanted to not have to always be changing the code for every new non-assurance service in place. So we put into place some new and enhanced general provisions on how you deal with all non-assurance services. If we turn to the next slide, I think I am going to pass the baton over to Diane, and she will start dealing with professional skepticism and professional judgment.
Thank you, Gary. And thanks, Galina, for the opportunity to talk to the group about the work of the Ethics Board. So as you'll see from the slide, I will start and now talk a little bit about professional skepticism and professional judgment. The topic of professional skepticism is the concept. It's truly a concept that's rooted in the auditing standards. However, the code also deals with it, and it's dealt with as part of the description of independence. Again, that's in the audit and assurance context. So at the same time that the Ethics Board was working on releasing the first set of exposure drafts into the safeguards and structure projects that Gary talked about, that would ultimately form part of the Restructure Code, the IAASB, the sister board, was released an invitation to comment with a number of proposals and questions relating to enhancing audit quality in the public interest. This invitation to comment, it summarized the work of a joint professional skepticism working group. This joint working group had representatives not just of the Ethics Board, but the Audit Board and the Education Board as well. And pretty much all three standard setting boards, Audit, Ethics, and Education, had representatives on that joint working group. And that joint working group was formed to initially deal with questions about whether auditors are appropriately exercising professional skepticism in the audits, which is in fact an audit quality issue at first. But the feedback that we heard on that invitation to comment suggested the need for some broader considerations. And the professional skepticism working group, that joint working group, then made a number of recommendations to all three standard setting boards. For the Ethics Board, the working group recommended that the code include guidance to explain how compliance with the fundamental principles support the exercise of professional skepticism in the context of audit and assurance engagements. But at the same time that the Ethics Board heard from respondents to the ITC, we were also getting feedback on our own exposure drafts that the concept of professional skepticism should be featured more prominently in the code. Specifically, we heard that due to increasing complexities of business and financial reporting, changes in business models, and rapidly advancing technologies, the roles and expectations of professional accountants are really changing. There's clearly a public interest need for the code to address questions about whether professional accountants should be accepting information at face value, and whether certain aspects of the concept of professional skepticism could actually be applied to all professional accountants, including those who prepare financial statements. However, as the concept of professional skepticism was so closely and historically applied to audits, there were a lot of concerns, including from some members of the Audit Board, that there may be potentially unintended consequences if the concept of professional skepticism were applied more broadly. So in an effort to recognize these concerns, but at the same time take a measure towards being responsive to the professional skepticism working group's recommendations, the Ethics Board approved a project and recognizing this was really a short-term measure and that there were longer-term issues that ultimately needed to be dealt with. This project established new application material in the code, and that new application material not only explains how the compliance of the fundamental principles support professional skepticism, but in addition, there's also new application material to emphasize the importance of obtaining an understanding of facts and circumstances when exercising professional judgment. The board believes that this new application material clarifies and makes more explicit the expectations that are already implicit in the code. As far as where this material is located, it can be found in the Conceptual Framework, which is in section 120 of the new code. I will talk about the longer term issues and the approach that the board has taken to deal with them later in the presentation. But as for now, I'd like to close off some of the other revisions that were made as part of the restructured code on the next slide. Helena, if we could move to the next slide. So on this slide, I want to talk a little bit about the revisions that have been made as a result of the board's applicability project. It became very clear from the board's projects related to revising the Part C, extant Part C of the restructured code, that there are several revisions, there are several improvements, I should say, in the PIB section of the code that might also apply to professional accountants in public practice. For example, the PIB section of the code includes a new section that deals with pressure to breach the fundamental principles. It also includes a new section to assist professional accountants to prepare and present financial information. The extant code had a statement in it that said that professional accountants in public practice might find the provisions in the PIB section relevant based on their circumstances. It became very clear that there were different interpretations of that statement. So it's in the public interest, the board felt it's important to clarify in the restructured code that the revised provisions in the PIB section, to clarify how it applies to all professional accountants in public practice. So these revised provisions make it clear that all professional accountants, including PIBs and professional accountants in public practice, they have a responsibility to consider the context of each ethical issue and look throughout the code, like think about all the provisions in the code, irrespective of where it's located, whether it's in Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, or in the extant code, that would be Part A or Part C or Part B, and then determine which of these provisions apply. And the applicability paragraphs now make it very clear that professional accountants in public practice have a responsibility to consider the context of those of the ethics issue and look to the provisions in Part 2 of the code, which was formerly extant Part C, and apply it as appropriate. And so this project, the results is really 2 or 3 paragraphs in the restructured code. I should say it's really 2 requirements. It elevates what used to be it's a little more robust than what was in the extant code, because it's now a requirement to consider all the information, and it also includes examples of how that requirement might be applied. Next slide, please. On this slide, I just want to, it's just an overview to kind of alert everyone that a new code of ethics is coming, and it just highlights and summarizes some of the new and revised provisions that will be included. And it's expected that this new handbook will be available sometime in the third quarter of 2018. And on the next slide, I'd like to talk about the effective date for those revised, new and revised provisions. So the effective date for the Restructure Code in its simplest form is by June 2015 to 2019. So it's June 15, 2019 would be the effective date for the Restructured Code. The Part 1, 2, and 3. For Parts 4A, the provisions relate to independence for audits and reviews. It's for financial statement periods beginning on or before June 15, 2019. And similarly a similar time frame for Parts 4B. The effective dates for the Restructured Code, and this is important, it does not change the effective dates for the long association and no-CLAR provisions that were developed using the old structure and drafting conventions. And for those who follow the work of the Ethics Board closely, these are already available and was released in last year as the no-CLAR provisions are now effective and available as final pronouncements. And the long association close-up document is where the revised provisions for long association exist, and these will become effective by December 15th, 2018. And the effective dates for the no-CLAR and long association provisions are reflected on the next slide. I'd like to move on to slide 21, where I'll talk about a little bit about what the board is doing to help promote awareness and the rollout and the plans for rolling out the Restructured Code. The board recognizes the importance of getting the word out with respect to the revisions that have been made to the code, and as part of having a strategic approach to getting those messages delivered in a consistent way, the board has established a working group to assist in pulling together a number of tools that might involve, that will include the standard package of a basis for conclusions, as well as adequate documents and fact sheets. But in addition, the working group is overseeing the development of videos with question and answer series, publications and articles to deal with specific topic areas. For example, one of the key changes that have been made is to the enhanced conceptual framework. Gary talked a little bit about that. The working group will seek to develop checklists and flow charts to help explain the changes that have been made to the conceptual framework. On the next slide, I'd like to talk about the board's activities related to its current and future strategy work plan. As Gary mentioned, the board has made quite a bit of progress in this area. The survey document was released in last year, and the board has received significant feedback on those. More than 130 respondents submitted feedback on that survey, and the feedback has been analyzed, and the board is going to consider a draft consultation paper at its March meeting in New York in a couple of days, actually. And that in that draft consultation paper, the board has already outlined a few existing pre-commitments, and those pre-commitments relate to, of course, the inducements project, which is an ongoing project, and the E-code, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, as well as professional skepticism, non-assurance services, fees, and technology. On the next slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about the inducements project. The inducements project, which is actually formally known as it used to be presented or called the professional, it used to be called the revision of Part C, and it was phase 2 of the revision of Part C. And that project, the board released an exposure draft last year to clarify just kind of clarify the boundaries for offering and accepting inducements. That exposure draft included a clear prohibition for offering or accepting inducements with an intent to improperly influence behavior. It also included guidance to help professional accountants apply the conceptual framework to understand how to deal with threats that are created by offering or accepting inducements. The exposure draft makes it clear and includes a description of inducements which assist in its application. And that exposure draft, the comment period closed in December of last year, and the board is planning to consider the feedback from respondents on that exposure draft, as well as the revisions that have been made to address that feedback at its March meeting. This is the very last piece of the puzzle in terms of the restructured code. As I mentioned before, the handbook is coming out related to the new and restructured code is coming out in the third quarter of 2018. That handbook will include, or we're planning for that handbook to also include the inducements provisions, because the board is anticipating finalizing the inducement revisions in June 2018. On the next slide. So the board recognizes the need to have the code easy to access by all professional accountants that are on the go, we also understand the need to have the code be functional in terms of being able to deliver the information that's needed about ethical issues in a quick way. We also think that it's important for the code to be easy to navigate. And already we have a web-based code that's available online, which assists in helping navigate the code in terms of having hyperlinked definitions and terms, and links to certain concepts throughout the code. but we'd like to take this one step further and have the not only just revise when we revise and convert the restructured code to an electronic format, we'd like to take it one step further and leverage the advancing technologies that are available to help enhance the functionality and usability of the code. This initiative is really in its early days, and the plan is for the first launch of the first phase to be done by the time the restructured code becomes effective in June 2018. On the next slide, I'd like to talk about professional skepticism, the longer-term initiative that the board has underway. As I mentioned earlier, the additions that have been made to the restructured code were really a short-term measure. There are longer-term issues, for example, questions that have been raised about whether or not the applicability of professional skepticism should be extended to all professional accountants, and questions about what the behavioral characteristics of professional accountants should be and whether they're adequately captured or described in the code. These questions are all issues that the Ethics Board will talk about at its March meeting when they consider a draft consultation paper that has been developed by the Professional Skepticism Working Group. The goal of this initiative is really to think about how and whether what the code says about professional skepticism can support and reinforce the exercise of professional skepticism in audits and assurance, but also to explore whether aspects of professional skepticism could be applied more broadly to the work of other professional accountants. Naturally, there's going to be a need for close coordination with the Audit and Education Board as the board proceeds in this area. And we also think that it's going to be very important to hear from stakeholders as far as their views about whether or not the proposals or I shouldn't call it proposals, the initial thinking is responsive to some of the concerns. As far as plans for getting that initial thinking, views on that initial thinking, the board plans to have that consultation paper released by May of 2018, and is currently thinking about undertaking roundtables during the June to July timeframe, and to get views on the ideas in that consultation paper. On the next slide, I'd like to talk about non-assurance services. As a follow-up to the Safeguards project, the board established a working group in December 2017 to consider some issues related to non-assurance services. And this really is in response to an ask from the regulatory community as well as the Public Interest Oversight Board, and the questions that have come up is about whether the board, whether or not the non-assurance services provisions in the code are sufficiently robust in terms of the prohibitions. As part of the Safeguards project, the board received several suggestions from some regulators who thought that the code's prohibitions related to non-assurance services that are provided to an audit client should be at least the same as those in local jurisdictions, for example, in the EU and in some local jurisdictions like South Africa and the US. So this initiative is really going to deal with questions about whether the principles-based approach that allows for permitting some non-assurance services to be provided to audit clients, whether it should be a little more rules-based, and whether we should have explicit prohibitions for certain non-audit services. So, for example, there have been questions about whether there should be an outright prohibition for providing accounting and financial reporting services to audit clients. Or there's also questions about whether auditors should be permitted to provide internal audit services to the audit clients. So this initiative will seek to flush out these issues a little more. As far as next steps, the board is going to consider a briefing paper that summarizes those issues in closer detail, in a little more detail at its March meeting. And the thinking is that we will have roundtables to solicit views about some of those questions and the board's initial plans as far as a way forward, and during a series of roundtables that will take place in June to July timeframe. So as far as the roundtables for the professional skepticism and the non-audit services, it would essentially be at the same time. Thinking this would be a one-day event, and we're still finalizing logistics as far as the specific location for those events. But for right now, the board's thinking in June through July, and the locations would be North America, Europe, and Asia. On the next slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about the other existing pre-commitment related to the fees. There's been quite the board has received a number of questions from the regulatory committee, including the PIOB, about whether there should be explicit provisions relating to fees. For example, there have been questions and concerns about lowballing and the impact that it might have on audit quality. There are also concerns about the firm's business model and the impact that it might have on audit quality. And as a result of these concerns, the board has undertaken an initiative. It's really a fact-finding initiative at this stage. It's very early days, to really just explore the relationship, whether or not there is a relationship between fees charged by audit firms and threats to compliance with independence and the fundamental principles. So far, the board is focused on understanding the level of audit fees for individual audit firms, the relative size of audit fees charged by partner, the office of the firm, and whether or not there is the ratio of fees charged for non-audit or non-assurance services compared to audit services, whether there's there's something to be learned from that. The board, as part of this fact-finding, has commissioned academic research, and we've received a report from that academic, which I guess the biggest thing that we've learned so far is that there is, the most significant thing we've learned so far is that there is, in fact, a perception that threats to independence are increased when when a firm receives non-audit fees from when a firm also provides non-assurance services to its audit clients. So that there is a concern that the fees charged for non-assurance services creates perceptions about independence issues. To better understand the nature of these issues, the Ethics Board has released a fees questionnaire. This questionnaire has separate questions for each stakeholder group, and we want to hear from all different stakeholders. There's still time, just about 2 more days, to respond to that questionnaire, and the questionnaire has a number of different questions about the fee-related issues. The board is going to consider some preliminary views in relation to that questionnaire at its March meeting, and it plans to do a full review of the feedback on that questionnaire, as well as consider a final recommendation in relation to this fees project. The next slide. I'd like to talk a little bit about technology. So the board has another initiative, and that's the last thing I'll talk about as far as its strategy workflow program. It's exploring, and I would say this very early days, just trying to get an understanding of the varying trends and developments in technology. For example, blockchain, big data, cloud computing, etc., and really understand the impact that it has on the profession and the work of professional accountants. And this is clearly a strategic priority for the board, as it's important to understand how professional accountant skills might be impacted by these changes in technology, and what changes might be needed in the code or maybe in additional guidance for professional accountants. I'd like to now, just move on to, I've now concluded my prepared remarks, and as you'll see on the next slide, I'm ready to have any questions that the group has for Gary and I.
Thank you very much, Diane. Thank you very much, Gary. We have a dedicated question and answer session following all speakers. So if you don't mind, I would like to thank you for your very rich presentation on all of these updates and changes to the codes. It was very interesting to hear about the rollout initiatives and the potential changes to the code to make it an e-code and the work on the fees. We will be following that closely, and I hope participants will have a few questions for you in the Q&A session that I will launch following Katharine's presentation. Now let me call Katharine, if you hear us, let me pass over to you so you provide to us an update from IFAC's SMP Committee. Katharine, if you hear us, over to you. Thank you.
Helena, thank you very much indeed. Good day, everyone. And thank you for asking me to talk about the work of IFAC's SMP Committee. I'm aware that we're running just a tiny little bit late here, so I will endeavour to keep this short. My name is Katharine Bagshaw. I am the Deputy Chair of the SMP Committee, and just for the avoidance of any doubt, SMPC stands for Small and Medium Practitioners Committee. In my day job, I deal with auditing standards for the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. I've been there for over 20 years now. And prior to that, I did a lot of work in Central and Eastern Europe in the late 1990s. And I was delighted to address this same group last year on the subject of ICAEW's work on data analytics. Next slide, please. So what does the SMPC do? Well, it represents the interests of SMPs, or it uses its best endeavours to do that. The SMPC meets 3 times a year, generally speaking, twice in New York, IFAC's headquarters, and then once in Africa, Europe or Asia. And we try to link that third meeting with a regional event run by a professional accountancy organisation, a PAO, or a regional grouping of PAOs. Now, most of the actual work is undertaken by task forces through additional meetings, through email and conference calls. We are, as a committee, comprised of 18 members, 18 technical advisors from 22 countries. And we have 3 main areas of focus, and they are input to policy regulation and particularly international standards. We develop and share tools, guidance and support, and we promote the visibility and recognition of SMPs. Now, we are not an independent standard setting body such as the IAASB. We are an IFAC committee, and as such, our work plan is aligned with that of IFACs. And what I'm going to do in the rest of this presentation broadly is go through the 3 main areas of focus. Next slide, please, Kalina. So, firstly, our robust and regular input on key projects. This is into policy, regulation and standard setting. So first of all, our input to standard setting boards. That's what SSB means on the slide. And this is principally input to the Auditing Standards Setting Board, the IAASB that Megan spoke about earlier, and to the Ethic Standards Board that Gary and Diane spoke to just a moment ago. And we do this in a number of ways. Firstly, at each of our meetings, IAASB and IESBA staff and task force members come and speak to us about specific projects. So, for example, the chair of the ISA 315 task force on risk analysis spoke to us at our November meeting. And at our most recent meeting a couple of weeks ago, we were addressed by staff and task force members on ISA 540 on estimates. That is very valuable to us. Secondly, an SMPC committee member attends both IAASB and IESBA consultative advisory group meetings, and that's what CAG stands for on the slide. Thirdly, the SMP responds to exposure drafts and consultation papers issued by the Standard Setting Board. Fourthly, IAASB meets on a quarterly basis, and we comment on many of the papers prior to that meeting. We are just in the process right now of commenting on papers for IAASB's March meeting in Amsterdam. And just in case anyone doesn't know this, those papers are in the public domain. Anyone can look at them on IAASB's website. And then finally, members of the SMPC take part in IAASB task forces and working groups. So, for example, I am a member of IAASB's ISA 315 task force on risk analysis. I'm also a member of the Agreed Upon Procedures Working Group, and that's what AUP means on the slide, Agreed Upon Procedures. Now, this is the very technical part of our work, and in the next 5 slides, I will look at the practical aspects of the SMPC's work. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the last slide, we looked at the first area of the SMPC's work, which is input into standards. In this slide, we look at probably the most important practical guide issued by the SMPC. Now, we're very proud of this. We're in the process of finalising the 4th edition of our guide to using ISAs in SMP audits. This guide has been downloaded nearly 100,000 times, and there are currently 20 translations that have been completed, 8 in progress. There's a list of these on the SMPC's website, and those translations are often sponsored by the professional accountancy organisations. We also know that a number of firms use the guide for training purposes, and sometimes they're used as the basis for firm manuals. The changes in the most recent edition cover auditor reporting, disclosures, auditor responsibilities in relation to other information, and internal audit. I do encourage you, if you've not seen this document, to have a look. There are 2 volumes. They include extensive illustrative case studies. They are quite long, but there are also PowerPoint slide decks to go with them, and a companion manual. I should also say that this guide is much improved on the first edition some years ago. Next slide, please, Kalina. Okay. Agreed upon procedures engagement. I've mentioned these before, AUP. We launched a publication, Agreed upon procedures engagements, a growth and value opportunity, back in December last year. So what is an AUP engagement? Well, they've been around for a long time, but there seem to be far more of them now than there used to be. They're what they say on the tin. The practitioner and the client agree upon a set of procedures to be performed, the practitioner performs them, and then they report their findings. They're more common now because regulators and grant-making bodies often ask for certain procedures to be performed as part of their regulatory activity or as a condition of making the grant. And many of you will be aware of the Horizon 2020 programme in Europe, which is an example of this. Another example is a regulator of an airline that might ask a practitioner to perform procedures relating to the number of passengers, or a grant-making body might ask for procedures relating to what the money's been spent on, or a newspaper might ask for procedures relating to the circulation of the newspaper. And this, we find, is an increasingly important part of SMP's work in a number of jurisdictions, and we see it continuing to expand in the coming years. And there are risks associated with doing it wrong, hence the need for guidance. And this guidance does include a number of short case studies with example procedures. We do find that practitioners, as part of our inquiries about this, practitioners are asked to do some odd things. And it's important that what is done corresponds to what's being reported, and that all makes sense in the context of the engagement as a whole, to prevent practitioners being inadvertently associated with misleading information. And we do believe that practitioners in many jurisdictions may be exposed to risk in that area, and firms certainly tell us that some of these engagements are flying under the radar. And of course, IAASB is revising the standard in this area. So a practical guide to implementation. Next slide, please. Guide to practice management. This guide consists of 8 modules, and it covers things like practice models and networks, building the firm, developing a people strategy, technology, client relationship management, risk management, and succession planning. Succession planning, a big issue in a lot of developed economies. Now, have a new chapter in the we say it's a 2017 update. It will be finalised in the next couple of months. It's on leveraging technology, what those technologies are, developing a strategy, hardware and software, and technology risks. Technology is an area that the SMP Committee has discussed at some length in our recent meetings. There were, for example, high hopes of data analytics for SMPs 2 or 3 years ago, but this seems to have been overtaken by the need for SMPs to understand the implications of blockchain and artificial intelligence and machine learning. And I'll come back to those issues a little bit later. Next slide, please. So finally, in terms of recent publications, we've produced a very short publication. This one is only 10 pages, called Creating Value for SMEs Through Integrated Thinking, The Benefits of Integrated Reporting, and that came out in August of last year. Now, this is not a how-to guide. Integrated reporting, as I'm sure you're all aware, is still work in progress for larger companies. But for SMEs, it does seem to have taken off in some jurisdictions, not in others. And the SMPC produced this in collaboration with the International Integrated Reporting Council, the IIRC. It's intended as an awareness-raising publication, educating SMPs as to what IR is and how it might benefit their clients. And if you don't know very much about integrated reporting, it's quite a useful introduction. Next slide, please. Okay, so just before we move on to the final section on advocacy for SMPs, I'd like to draw your attention to IFAC's Global Knowledge Gateway, which was launched back in 2014. Now, this is a really useful source of information for the profession globally. There are literally thousands of original articles and videos, but also news items and links to technical guidance from individual PAOs, material from accountancy journals, stuff from the mainstream media. It is very well curated. And in October last year, a new technology section was launched, and that features articles, videos, resources, all sorts of things covering, for example, blockchain, artificial intelligence, data analytics, cybersecurity, and so on and so forth. And I indicated before, there are significant implications, as you know, for firms of all sizes of these technologies. And again, if you've not had a look at this, I would encourage you to look at this new section on technology. Mainly because there's a lot of poor quality material on the internet on technology. And I have to say, in my view, what we have on the Gateway is very good quality generally. It's also specifically directed at accountants. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So finally, global representation and advocacy. The SMPC used to perform a global SMP survey every 2 years. It now produces one every year. The last one was performed in 2016. We got over 5,000 responses from 164 countries. Members of the SMP undertook over 20 speaking engagements last year and we organised 3 regional forums. These included 2 SMP tracks as part of the African Congress of Accountants meeting in Kampala in Uganda. We did a full day with the WorldBank in Vienna. We also did an event with the National Institute of Public Accountants in Colombia. We also provide input to IFAC's Public Policy and Regulation Advisory Group. Next slide, please. Okay, so going forward into 2018, our work plan remains in line with IFAC's overarching strategy, and it maintains our 3 key activity areas. So for input to standard setting boards, our priority IAASB projects are really all of those that Megan mentioned, those on quality control, risk analysis, estimates, and agreed upon procedures. And of course, if there is a consultation on the audit of SMEs, as Megan suggested there might be, we will of course be looking at that very, very closely indeed. Priority IESBA projects for our consideration this year include those on fees, inducement, and skepticism, among others. Next slide, please. In our second main area, resources and tools. So we've got promotional initiatives to raise awareness of the resources we have available for PAOs, and SMPs. A number of gateway articles planned on a variety of issues, but importantly, no new guides. No new guides at the moment. We feel quite strongly that we need to raise awareness of the good materials, such as the ISA guide, the practice management guide, the AUP guide that we already have. And then in terms of representation and advocacy, we're launching the 2018 Global SMP Survey. That will be launched within the next two months. Again, when that comes into your inbox saying, take a few minutes to answer this survey, can I suggest you just open that and have a look at it? The more responses we get, the better quality feedback we can give. And it is much better designed and written, much quicker to complete than it used to be. And as before, we have our outreach and partnership events, and we have input into public policy and regulation as it arises. And then the final slide, please, Kalina. So one thing I should say before closing is that the SMP committee, IFAC's SMP committee, like all SMP committees that any of you have ever been involved in, it covers a huge range of technical and practical areas. And given that we also have the international dimension, we've got a substantial divergence in practice across different jurisdictions. And this is a significant challenge. And we're reliant massively on the generosity of our members with their very valuable time and expertise. Now, this is my last year on this committee, and I've learned a huge amount from my fellow committee members in the 10 years I've been involved, first as a technical advisor and then as a member. And I would commend this group to any of those of you who are listening who might be interested in getting involved in this type of activity. It really is very rewarding, as well as important, obviously, to IFAC, its member bodies and SMPs across the world. And I would be very happy to go into more detail with anyone about this important work. Kalina has my contact details. So with that final plug for the SMP committee itself, I will hand you back to Kalina, having saved a little bit of time, I think, and thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Katharine. Let me now open the floor for questions. We are now available, the speakers are now available to take any questions from participants. Should somebody have a question, I will kindly ask you to unmute and to ask your question to either Megan, Diane and Gary, or for Katharine. So let me pause there for a minute and see if there's any incoming questions from the participants. While participants are thinking of questions, I have pre-prepared a few, and let me start with a question for Megan. So Megan, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay, well, Megan, thank you very much for explaining about the Skepticism Working Group, where you have the 3 boards working jointly on this project. I was wondering whether this is the first time when we have such a joint working group between the 3 standard setting bodies. Do you possibly see any potential future areas where the 3 bodies could collaborate in this way? Maybe you can share your views on this and point out some areas where you think this kind of collaboration can happen in the future, if any. Thank you, Megan.
Sure, thanks, Kalina, and that's a great question. So I think this is the first time that we've put a joint working group together that has had representatives from all of the 3 independent boards. But I think it's probably not going to be the last time. I think that we've got some specific things that we're trying to do, maybe a little bit more specifically to the way in which the Ethics Board and the Assurance Board and Audit and Assurance Board are working together. And we're really trying to put a much more enhanced focus on collaboration and coordination between the two boards. Obviously at the same time respecting that the boards are independent, so each board operates independent of the other, but that we have actually started to already coordinate, I think, a little bit more directly. We've actually had some joint sessions of our planning and steering committee. So the IAASB has a steering committee, and the Ethics Board has a planning committee, which sort of the senior committee that directs the activities of the board. And those two groups have had a joint session, and we actually had attendance from the chair and vice chair of the education board at the same time. We've had some joint sessions of the consultative advisory groups where there's actually a lot of overlapping membership anyway. And then we actually had a joint board session in June of last year, June or September, if my memory's fading me, where we had the opportunity to talk about some of the topics that are on our agenda, and including the way in which we might coordinate with one another going forward. So I don't have a specific example of something similar to the Professional Skepticism Working Group, but we are, for example, keeping at the staff level an active inventory of the various different projects and the issues, and then some active coordination between the two boards so that we can work together as we need to, and different things. So I did mention that on the IAASB side, we're specifically looking at the changes in the restructured code and thinking about those. I mean, most importantly, probably in the context of our quality control projects, but there are implications for the other standards as well. I think I mentioned the AUP project, where we're looking specifically at a question around the independence question. We're looking at the question around the objectivity of the engagement quality control reviewer, and that's part of our ISQC2 project. And then I think when we actually get into our group audits project, there's probably some questions around application of the requirements around relevant ethical requirements and independence, where we will, we'll work closely with the ethics board to make sure that we're keeping things aligned. So I think we as both boards have been told, or the importance of proper coordination and collaboration has been emphasized by both the Public Interest Oversight Board as well as our our important stakeholders. So it's something that is top of mind and a key focus for both boards. So I'll pause with that.
Thank you, Megan. I have now a question for Diane and Gary. Last April, that's almost a year ago, we had a virtual learning session that focused on the new standard, responding to non-compliance with laws and regulations, NOCLAR. This standard, as you mentioned, became effective July 2017. So Diane and Gary, I was wondering whether you're able to share with us a few insights from your experience based on the engagement with the global profession. What are the early impacts of application of this standard? And if you have any examples that you can share with us on the application of NOCLAR. So either Diane or Gary, maybe you can say a few words on the NOCLAR. Thank you.
Sure, I'll take the question. So as part of its ongoing outreach activities, the board is actively engaging with jurisdictions to understand the experiences with respect to adoption and implementation of NOCLAR. What we're learning right now is jurisdictions are proceeding through, as far as like the adoption of NOCLAR, they're really proceeding with the natural processes for adoption and implementation. Then the way, what I mean by that is the way a specific jurisdiction adopts any standard is different based on what processes are in place in that respective jurisdiction. So if I were to focus on some of the G20 jurisdictions, for a country like South Africa, they are well on the way in terms of the adoption, and they've undertaken their own initiatives to assist in promoting the awareness and adoption of NOCLAR. It's incorporated into their standards, and they've developed their own Q&As to assist in their practitioners answer some of the more challenging questions. But we're also hearing from other jurisdictions like Canada and the US, where their stakeholders are having more challenging issues around legal protection and confidentiality. And so they're navigating these issues in their own way. But what we are in fact hearing, like, and unanimously from all the jurisdictions, is there is a commitment to really embrace the NOCLAR standard and figure out how best to implement it.
Yeah, perhaps I could add to that, Diane, just by giving the specifics around the Canadian situation, since I'm very familiar with it. In Canada, adoption of the code is done on a province by province basis as opposed to at the national level. So each of the provinces have to consider what the requirements are. It is a fact that there's a commitment to move forward in Canada, but because the legislative requirements may be different in one province versus another, you have to respect what those legislative requirements are. And dealing with issues such as confidentiality, there are some situations in one province that I'm aware of where they have about a dozen different requirements dealing with confidentiality based on the different pieces of legislation. And you need to have this thing all work out on what needs to be changed in legislation in order to be able to allow this to happen.
Thank you very much for the repeat, Gary. I have a question for Katharine. So Katharine, thank you very much for your insight on the working in the 10-year experience with the SMP Committee. And as you explained, the SMP Committee is engaged in providing inputs to the standard setting boards. In your view, is the voice of the SMPs, and especially the SMPs from developing countries, represented sufficiently in the standard setting process? And what can national and regional PAOs do to strengthen their input in the future? So maybe you can tell us your view based on your 10-year experience working with the SMP Committee and providing inputs to the standard setting process. Over to you, Katharine.
Thank you, Kalina, and another great question. Well, and not one that's been asked for before as well. It's a good question. It's long been acknowledged that as a result of their relatively limited resources, SMPs are not as easily able as larger firms to keep up with or contribute to the activities of standard setting boards. And this is one reason why the SMPC exists. It's also the reason why the SMP Committee spends a significant amount of its resources providing input to the standard setting boards. And I should say that SMP Committee members represent a good mix of both developing and developed countries who all provide helpful input on the distinct challenges that practitioners face in different jurisdictions. And I'm often struck by the variation in comments that we get. However, it is important that the standard setting boards continue to seek innovative ways of engaging with SMPs. This is a work in progress. It's also important that professional accountancy organisations continue to publicise the work of IFAC, including the work of the standard setting boards and the SMPC. And that individual SMPs, individual members, are encouraged to come forward to offer input. And it's about the next generation and raising awareness. A younger practitioner may be interested in the work of IFAC or its SMPC or its standard setting boards, but it's not but not be in a position to contribute much early in their career. But professional accountancy organisations can encourage those interested individuals to develop their interest over a period of time. And many PAOs have their own SMP committees, and of course PAOs can and should use those to solicit input to the various standard setting board projects so that their own SMP voices may be heard. But we don't underestimate the work involved in that. It involves continuous, proactive engagement. You can't simply send emails to people and hope that they will respond. So I would encourage more PAOs to engage with the standard setting process because it's important that the boards hear from a wide range of constituencies and regions and can consider feedback on the potential impact of their proposals early on in the standard setting process. Now, we realise this involves work for PAOs that often have limited resources, and I would say just one thing in that context. PAO staff who have a lot to do, they can follow the development of SSB projects, and if they can submit comment letters in response to formal exposure drafts, please remember that it's not necessary to provide responses to all of the questions, and PAO staff can perfectly legitimately prioritise and focus on the specific areas that their members may have strong concerns about. If there are 24 questions, there is no obligation to answer all 24 questions if that is asking too much. But that said, I should remind us all that standard setting is a team effort, and the interest of everyone concerned, all of the stakeholders, and that includes larger firms and academics and regulators as well as SMPs. All of those views have to be balanced. But I do have a sense that at present high quality input to the standard setting boards on SMP issues is very, very important right now. And those calling for the voices of SMPs to be heard more clearly must consider what they can do to ensure that standards are fit for the audit of entities of all sizes. And of course, we will look forward to more information about the audit of SME item on IAASB's March agenda as and when that becomes available. And if there is a consultation, as Megan suggested, that there might be later this year, it is absolutely critical that the number and quality of responses to that particular consultation, more than perhaps any other, is as high as it can be. This discussion has been a very long time coming. Thank you.
I would like to thank you very much, Megan, Diane, Gary, and Katharine, for the excellent presentations. I would like to thank all of you for your participation. This distance learning event is recorded, and an edited recording will be made available on our website in due course. Let me also use this opportunity to advertise the next Audit Training of Trainers virtual workshop with a focus on integrated reporting that is scheduled to take place next week, Wednesday, March 7, 2018, starting at 2:30 p.m. Vienna time. Let me also use the opportunity to inform you on two upcoming EU Reparis program events. We have the CFRR IFAC Joint Regional Education Community of Practice that will take place on April 11th, 2018 in Vienna. We also have the Training of Trainers workshop with a focus on services for SMEs that is scheduled for April 12th, 2018, and will also take place in Vienna at the Joint Vienna Institute. Invitations and agendas will follow soon. I'm looking forward to seeing all of you then and reconnecting since our last meeting. Please also visit the CFRR homepage for more details on these upcoming events. I would like to thank you again and wish you a good day. Goodbye.